Hello, everybody. Welcome on in. I'm your host, Andi Petrillo. It's Change the Game, Canadian Women in Sport. Today's focus in particular, because we always choose topics which we feel are pretty relevant. And this one is media influence on women's sport. So I'm going to have four athletes join me in this hour and kicking things off. Two of my favorite. I cover their sports extensively, obviously. Roseline Filion, we know, a retired diver, but so accomplished in what you've been able to do in Olympic, two-time Olympic bronze medalist, three-time world medalist, as well as Pan American Games and Commonwealth Games champion. And Pam Buisa, we, feel so honored to have women's rugby sevens on CBC Sports, and you are a Pan American Game 2019 champion as well. And looking forward to the Tokyo Olympics as we keep our fingers crossed and moving ahead to that. Yeah, that's for sure. But today's focus, as much as, we'll talk about, your careers and personally and kind of what's going on in your lives. We want to talk about media and the coverage of women's sports, in particular. And I want to know how perhaps the lack of women's sports coverage in media has affected your career. And Rosie, I'll begin with you as you look back on it now. Do you feel like there wasn't enough? Where could it have changed? And just how did it affect maybe what people knew about you and what you were doing on the global stage?
It's so hard to say because I feel like amateur sports or Olympic sports were not covered enough at basically even men and women. But with time, we got a lot more coverage with the years. But I feel like it's about a story. It's not necessarily about a performance, but it didn't affect that much my career personally because all I wanted to do was dive and win medals and go to the Olympics. And what happened outside of that goal for me didn't really matter. But I feel now looking back, being retired and wanting to see more, hear more stories, see more young girls, women, because I feel in my career, I've got so many young girls reaching out and asking questions, and it didn't really change it because we don't see it more on TV now. That's how I started. I saw Andi Petrillo win her medal at the Olympics, and it's like that we're going to influence and be able to introduce young girls into sports and show them that they can accomplish everything they want.
Mm-hmm. You're right. The high performance sport, they usually hit the airwaves once every 4 years as you're getting ready for an Olympic cycle. And then you start to look at diving way more. But Pam, obviously a bit of a different story. Before we even came on here, I had said that, for the last couple of years now, CBC Sports has been showing rugby sevens, both the men and women competing. And I'm curious, like how, the reaction from the team in knowing that those events are being shown, and where else would you like to see media coverage go with rugby sevens, especially now that it is an Olympic sport as well?
Yeah, I definitely think it being a team sport's a very interesting dynamic. I think with like individual sports, you can get a better understanding of like the story and who they are and kind of like that. With a team sport, it's kind of hard to kind of look at the team holistically and not pick a few and like focus on that. So I think in terms of where I want to see our representation, the same places where we see male representation. I think that oftentimes it's very much, there's an emphasis when you look at, TV, when you look at the athletes, especially when it comes to contact sports and which bodies do contact sports. I think there's a very big, there's a lot of opportunity to showcase that, yes, women do hit people as well. Contact sport is a part of our game as well. And I think that a lot of the times we don't have the opportunity to feature that to the same extent. Because sometimes even to see us, you have to pay. You have to, there's different TV channels that people don't have access to. But the same spaces in which the men are, I'd like to see us there too.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned that, because you look at this last year, there have been some historic deals as well for, certain women's leagues. You look at the National Women's Soccer League and signing that great year with CBS. So yes, championship games will be on the main network. A lot of stuff though, Pam, to your point, will be on streaming, but still it's seen, as a big step. The National Women's Hockey League signed a deal with NBC that their semifinal and their final of their bubble games going on right now will be on NBC. So that's a pretty big deal. And I guess, Pam, I'll just come back to you because, again, as a team sport and as a sport that sees a series as well, right, where there is an end goal and there is like a table and a standings and everything. Do you see that as at least a step in gathering information on where interest lies and then seeing it grow from there?
I would see it as a step in the sense that some things are being done. Is it enough? That's a whole completely different story. I think it's not enough. I think steps are nice when you are planning on doing things forward. But as I see right now, women have been playing sports from the beginning of time. So having steps to just show us isn't enough. Having steps to, incrementally change things isn't enough. Just do it. It's a very simple concept. And I think a lot of the hesitancies, which also showcase itself within, not just on within sport, but beyond that, is that when we see like politicians, it's always steps. It's a step forward. But what are we actually doing to make it happen? Like, it's not enough to just say, okay, yes, like we're showing up. NBC is now signing us. It's like, we've been playing this sport for how long? Why is it just a step? Why is it not done? And that's kind of where my pushback is that yes, there has been waves and there's more visibility, but more doesn't necessarily mean it's enough, which needs to change.
Rosie, in your sport, I feel like the women and the men can get equal attention because of, you're either, yes, you can be doing synchro partnership or there can be a single diver, but it's one of those sports where I almost like equate it in some ways to tennis, right? If you're just really exciting and you're winning and you're fun to watch, like people will give that attention. That's my outside perspective.
But it is.
And I'm wondering, from the inside too, like how did you see the way the media coverage, both the men and women in the world of diving?
Well, if you take the Olympics as an example, the last event is considered as the most important one, and it's the men's 10-meter final. So all the schedule is around what's getting more attention, and it's the male event, the big one, the most impressive one. So it's been like that for years. And Pam, you were saying it, that like NBC signed for hockey, but it's sports that everybody knows, everybody sees, even on the outside, but it doesn't give an opportunity for sports that we don't know anything about. With it could be, I'm saying like swimming or speed skating or even rugby. It could be anything, archery. We don't see all of these sports enough, and most of them are attracted to, I don't know, maybe like in diving, the men's are probably more impressive. They do harder dives, for example, in my sports, but on the women's side as well, because the scoring is always so tight. You never know who's going to win, and it's impressive as well. I don't understand why it has to be focused on what's more impressive or choose the men's at the end. It's still very strange to me.
Well, I get what you're saying because, even when you take it to track and field, both the men and women race the 100.
Yeah.
But it's always seen like this. Yeah. This is the marquee race. And it's always, that they're alluding to the men's 100, not necessarily the women's 100. So is that part of the struggle when dealing with media coverage and it's not like I'm trying to put so much power in the media's hand, but time and time again, it is proven that what the media pays attention to, they are the deliverer of the message, that's what people will believe is important. So if I tell you the men's 100 meter is a big deal over the women's, you're just naturally going to believe that. And I always use the example of the World Juniors. I just do. Don't get me wrong, World Juniors, it's exciting. There's some incredible young talent and men playing hockey there. Bottom line is TSN did an incredible job marketing that tournament and telling Canada that this is what you tune into starting December 26th every single year. So now we're like, yes, this is the biggest tournament of the year. Like the media can do that. So is that part of the struggle, as I go back to you, Rosie, when it comes to media coverage, maybe is the storylines that they share, maybe it is the timing of even where they put certain events in a broadcast? Because if I'm going to end my broadcast off with a 10 meter, I'm doing it with the men, not the women. And does that matter?
I don't think it matters anymore. It might maybe used to before because it was maybe that much more impressive. I don't know, but I feel like nowadays it won't be important if the women's event is on a Friday afternoon. People are going to be there because the media has a role to promote men and women. So if your story is well presented and you're able to get your crowd's attention by telling a story, showcasing the results of the female athlete that's going to be performing, it doesn't matter if the event is at the beginning or at the end of the event. If your role is to catch the attention by telling a story. So that's why scheduling now in my head, it doesn't really matter. It's about the athletes, the performance, and the story you're telling while you're having that time frame of showing the event on TV. So and it's a struggle also because you want to have airtime, but most often it's only for like once in 4 years. So how you're going to present, it takes years to build up that momentum into, these are the 2 weeks that I'm going to show sports. And you have to build that up with nothing to put on TV before in some ways. So it's all the way you plan it. And I don't know why it's still oriented into a men's event at the end.
Yeah. We're going to get into just the dispersal of coverage and how the digital world maybe can be a friend in that sense, right? Because now you have more platforms where you can show sports. But I'll come back to you, Pam, because something we've also mentioned when it comes to rugby, especially rugby sevens, the rules are the same for men and women. Like when you look at sports that have, even hockey, it's different for men and women. Like there are just certain rules that are different, not in rugby. It is, pretty much identical. But why do you think, or maybe where do you think the misconceptions are when it comes to covering women's sport over, men's sport? And why do you think there's maybe still some resistance in covering women's sport?
I think, at least when I think about media and the distribution of it, it's an institution. And I think with that, there's concepts of masculinity that gets produced and reproduced. And oftentimes with that reproduction, we see what masculine means. And we think that a masculine person is a male. We think a masculine person looks a certain type of way. And so there's a lot of emphasis, I find, especially in the media, when it comes to who is feminine and who is deemed feminine. And then when it comes to being an athlete, there's so much of that perpetuated in the media. And I think when we see it in commentating, in like someone's appearances, I remember listening to a commentator that was talking about Charity Williams against another player, and he was like, dreadlock on dreadlock. None of them, only one of them had dreadlocks, so like things like that, just emphasizing their appearances, sexualizing them. And I think with contact sport especially, I find that when we talk about danger, risk, and even like violence in a sense, there's a lot more, exposure to male sports as opposed to women. And I think that I also play rugby 15s. And as right now, this year is the World Cup for the women's rugby 15s team. And we are yet to see where that will be shot. Like we don't even know if it's going to be covered. Right now we're talking with, Rugby Canada and all these other organizations as to how we can promote the story. Because currently right now we're saying that, women sports doesn't sell, right? Unless we're either A, sexualizing them, or B, making them seem as though, we're highlighting other things outside of their athletic ability, which is a fundamental issue to the institution of media.
It's dead on with that. And yes, Marissa, I see you. Soccer is identical as well. Very true. And I've had this conversation before when it comes to masculine and feminine. I said, those are make-believe traits. Like those are things that we as a species have created, because I can be, a female, but I can tell you right now, I'm very masculine. Like when you look at what defines the traits, right? Like it's so true. And you're right. You try to like take, and especially women, I find more than anything, you kind of put them in this little bubble, and you do talk more. So at least I've noticed this when it comes to rugby, right? We have no problem like mentioning a guy. 6'2", 230 pounds. This is his speed, whatever, right? But when it comes to a woman, it's like, this is where she went to school. This is where and I'm like, no, tell me she's 5'9". Tell me she's 165. Tell me she's going to knock you on your ass in like I want to, you kind of have to have that same type of conversation, right? And I wonder, Rosie, like, are those also some of the difficult things where, you know, you just feel like the man will be talked about, you know, as far as his strength and his power and agility, and women, sometimes it just feels like there's I don't know if it's just a fear, or maybe to Pam's point, there's this subconscious bias that maybe you just don't see women in that way because that's not a feminine thing.
Yeah, well, sometimes, usually women would hide their weight first at the beginning because being scared of being judged. I would do that. I would not tell anybody how much I weigh because I didn't want anybody to tell me, well, that's not the weight for a diver, or, you know, go with those comments. But I think it's getting better and better because we don't pay that much attention to guys' physique in a sense, and we value more the women's side doing really hard dives now and being like, this woman's powerful, she can do exactly what the guys are doing on either the springboard, on the platform. So I think that conversation is being changed, and the women's performances are being more valued in the sense that they can do the hard stuff too, and it's impressive, and it's probably more impressive now because they're able to do it. And for so many years they thought the women's event was, oh, it's just easier dives. So, you know, and if I bring you back to like 12 years ago, Emily Haymans on the 10 meter she was the only woman doing a men's dive on the 10 meter. So that was when it started the women would gain more respect in the sense of strength in the diving world.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for the longest time, aerials wasn't part of the Olympic program for women because there was a belief that if they landed from that kind of height, their uterus would fall out. So I feel like
ridiculous.
I don't even know what to say to that because I'm like, that's not how the body works. But anyways, the reason why I bring that up is because, you know, Pam, how important is it maybe to have more women, you know, on the broadcast? We talk about this, right? Women, diversity, people of color, because maybe a woman being on a panel can turn around and say, that is the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my life. Like, our uterus is not going to fall out if we jump from a high, and like, do you know what I mean? Like, so how important do you think it is to add that diversity without it being tokenism, right? Mm-hmm. Because that also bothers the crap out of me, because I find if you're trying to, tokenism also means sometimes that the wrong person's getting the job. Yeah. It doesn't mean they're the right person for the job. So you want to make sure you're also getting the right person, you know, for the job. So especially on the side of women, where do you see, you know, media doing that? Is that former players? Is it trying to get more people like involved that way who really truly understand the game too, and kind of see them move more into analyst roles? Like how do you see the media also progressing in that sense with women being a part of their coverage?
Yeah, I think with that, it's also looking at how we can not just change the position and have different people filling the gap, but looking at a structural change. Does having a woman of color change the system? And does that mean that we are now anti-racist? Does having more women there mean that there is less sexism? I don't know. But I do think that what needs to happen is a systemic change. Are we actually shifting our mindsets? Are we having policies? Are we actually naming the issue, stating that there is an issue, that there is a discrepancy with people who identify as women? I think even the understanding of who is a woman also is under negotiation. I think a lot of people think that women are cisgendered women, right? I think when we talk about trans women, when we talk about people that may not necessarily fit the ideals as to what is considered a woman, then there's also pushback there. So I think when it comes to media companies and approaching different things, I think, we do need to have more women in broadcasting positions, front and center, not just commenting on other women's sports, but also within, commenting on other male sports. And I think also with more representation, we have to, again, for it to not be tokenistic, is to ensure that the structure is shifting, not just the names and the people, but Also, it's the structure, is making sure that structurally we are uplifting and empowering those that have been disproportionately silenced and glossed over. We're making sure that we are considering them, not in just the formation of the ideas, but in the execution of all of it as well. So I think with that, in the representation, what we're getting the message out, it shouldn't just be like, there should be more empowerment ads that should be coming out, but also real and tangible things that has to come out, addressing things like systemic work things, and providing more opportunities for more women to be in those spaces, and making sure when they're there that they're supported. So if allegations come out, or if anything, that they have, resources to do well and to succeed and to be able to progress throughout the organization and company.
And we see it now, like in football, there's going to be referees, coaches at the Super Bowl, and in the NFL in general. So we see that coming. But what I'm asking myself is that the day we're not going to make that change a big deal, it's going to be a success. It's when you have to acknowledge the fact that, okay, I'm putting a woman there, and it's going to be the first time in history, but when it's getting normal and it should happen, you're not going to make a big deal out of it anymore. So that's the point where I want to go. And this weekend we saw it, you and Perdita for the first time co-hosting a show all together. It's huge. We've never seen that before. But the day it's going to be normal and nobody's going to say anything about it, it's going to be we're going to arrive, we're going to get there, so that's important too. Like, we see the change, but the time when we're not going to pay that much attention to it, or we're not going to try to put forward because we're making an effort, it's going to just be natural. It's going to be a success.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We definitely all want to reach that point where it's like two women hosting a national sports show. So what?
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly.
That's the normalcy of it for sure. Yeah. But what about also the storytelling too? And it kind of leads into, I guess, having, diversity, as, Marissa writing it as well, diversity, different perspectives and stuff, like the storytelling, because I find sometimes it's still a crutch. I'll point the finger at myself too, because I make a conscious effort to change this, because it's a world that I was brought up into. So sometimes I don't even realize that I'm doing it. But again, when we talk about women, and athletes and coming back, in particular, if they've just had a baby, right? Again, the storytelling is very different. I still think it's amazing. Obviously, the women's body is what bears the brunt, obviously, of the pregnancy, and to come back from that kind of change is still incredible. But it almost seems to be the story as well. Like, oh, she just had a baby, or she has 3 babies, and, she doesn't sleep, or she's got to take care. And then if a male athlete just had a kid, nobody talks about that, right? So there's still that kind of storytelling going on. And I guess, Pam, I'll come to you. And, is that just an old, tired narrative when it comes to a woman is still seen oftentimes as well as a mom, right? Where a man will always be the athlete, very rare. Usually when he's retired, he'll be known as the dad. But when he's in the heat of the competition, he's still a man. Whereas a woman, even though she's in the heat of the competition, is still a mom and a wife. Like, there's that kind of storytelling. Does that bug you? Or do you feel like, no, I actually like that, and maybe we should be doing it more for the men?
Yeah, I personally think there's strength in that. I think that, showcasing the athlete beyond just their abilities, there's a lot of strength to that. So yeah, highlight the fact that that person's a mother. But I would say the pushback then on the other side would be, yeah, also highlight that men have feelings, have children, have, maybe involved in volunteering. Why can't those aspects be highlighted? And I think that also is a testament of, again, when we think about concept of masculinity, oftentimes it's, you don't show emotion. You don't show these aspects that may be quote unquote feminine. And when we start to kind of push back on these binaries, you start to push back on these concepts and ideas that tell us that a man is this way and a woman is this way, then we can kind of move forward and break those barriers down. So I think that if anything, the story should evolve, and that not to see that there's weakness in showcasing that a woman can have children and is powerful in that. There's a lot of strength in that. I think on the other side, it's the emphasis should also be on their athletic ability. I want to know how many, if it's boxing punches and knockouts they've done, how many, I want to know that aspect. That should be emphasized. I want to know more about the athletic abilities as well. Oftentimes it's not provided and extended to a lot of women in those spaces. And I think that for the men's side, it needs to be, yes, alongside their athletic abilities, they're also really passionate about X, Y, and Z. And that should be also uplifted and applauded for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're so right, because I see it even on the men's side as well. Sometimes if you want to talk about them having a kid, or you want to talk about a tough moment that they've gone through, it's almost like it quickly gets dismissed. You don't talk about that when it comes to men. And I feel like that's very unfair, to a lot of men. And we just had, as we know, like Bell Let's Talk Day. And I can't tell you the amount of men, former and current athletes, who struggle a lot. And I wonder how much of that is because of the perception that's created, around them. But, on the flip side, obviously with women, to Pam's point, Rosie, you like telling those stories, but now it's like, you got to find that balance. Make sure you also appreciate and represent the athlete that they are too.
Exactly. Because the story is important, because what I feel I wanted to showcase is that I'm relatable. Like, young girls can see that I come from a regular house, homing, and brothers and cousins, and I'm just doing it because I'm passionate and I trained hard. The story of the personality makes the viewers at home being like, oh, I feel like her personality resembles to mine, and she accomplished that, so I can do that too. So I feel that storyline is important, but to showcase the results, the accomplishment is essential to follow up on that, on what we can showcase and inspire a younger generation to start up in sports, in any sports, or just in their regular lives, because we're talking about a lot of sports and accomplishments, but what athletes do, you can do it your work. You can do it whatever the goals you want to achieve. So the storyline is important, but to put the emphasis on the results and whatever you went through, and to grow up and be a better athlete is important to reach those little girls and want to stay in sport, because that's a struggle too.
Yeah. I'm going to throw, before I let you guys go here, my goodness, I feel like 30 minutes is just flying by between the three of us. I wonder, and I don't know if this is necessarily something the media can be a part of, or whether it's even just a message to send out to the general public. So this was a couple years ago. And again, when it comes to, male athletes, I'll use one in particular. So, you had David Beckham. I'm going to go soccer players here, but like, I know David Beckham and Cristiano Ronaldo in particular, like they did, underwear ads, and nobody really kind of batted an eye. Well, we did, but I mean, if anything, it was always like, look at them and you appreciate the work they put into their bodies, and obviously this athletic body. And now here it is promoting underwear. And then a couple of years ago, Serena Williams did something similar. And it was like, oh no, like you don't do that, right? And suddenly she's kind of sexualized and demeaned in a way that the male athletes who were doing it were not. So I don't even know if that's like, again, you look at certain sports, and again, like I look at gymnastics, and the men, there will be, in awe over their bodies, but a woman, oftentimes in her thing, it's like, completely sexualized. I don't know how you change that. I don't know. Maybe I'll begin with you, Pam, because I want both of you to say, like, what becomes the message to the general public who still will do that to also women? Like, a lot of times they will sexualize a woman where, for her body, the way she looks, choices she makes, but for the male athlete, it's celebrated. Look at that six pack. Look at the work that he puts into it, right? This is what a real athlete looks like. And, he's celebrated, whereas the woman is put down because how dare she? I don't know how we change that mentality in the court of public opinion.
I think when it comes to public opinion, it's what we make of it. So I think the more that it's there, that it keeps happening, that women are proud and showcasing their bodies, and I think that will create conversation. I think also naming that that's an issue. I think more conversations need to happen around, why is it that people feel uncomfortable when, I also train, that I also work out, I also want that six pack and, have one, so it's like, how do we make sure that, the public changes? and I think with that, it's, there's not a lot of exposure on both sides. I think that in a lot of predominantly male spaces, there's not a lot of female voices that are in those rooms. So what is the locker room talk? when we're talking about things like in football, when we are, in hockey or whatever the sport may be, what are the conversations going on there? And I think there's a lot of opportunity and potential for brands, organizations, and sponsors and stuff like that to showcase this, to equally invest to the same extent that they will go to showcase and broadcast men's sports, to do the same thing within women's sport, and just see the potential that it can have. Not just potential, but the opportunity for it to be there. And I think that with oftentimes when you look at these sports, I'll just use football, for example, we oftentimes don't see a woman commentator or describing the sport or being a part of the conversation. Is that when there's literally no visibility, when there's no conversations being had, and we don't see the representation in the room, you don't hear it, you don't see them, therefore you don't believe it, right? So if there's more opportunities for in predominantly male spaces to have, a female perspective, or just have different perspective in general, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that to change things.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Rosie.
I totally agree with you, Pam. It's hard to add on, but still, for me, I don't understand why it's a big issue, in the sense that if a guy poses with his underwear, there's no problem if a woman wants to do it. Like, in my head, it doesn't make sense. It's the same thing. I don't understand why it creates that whole conversation about body image, about what you're representing, about the image you want to project. It shouldn't be an image you want as a woman. If they're deciding for you what you're going to do and what you're going to project. So that mindset, I don't get. The more you do it, the more you give the opportunity to a woman athlete to showcase what she wants in a cover magazine, in an ad, or whatever the context is. If you give that opportunity to normalize what it should be normalized, we'll definitely be moving forward. But social media helps a little bit, because the athletes now have the control of their images and what I want to project on their Instagram, let's say. So they start the conversation doing like that, because they're in control of what they can do. And if they want to go forward with that type of content, they can.
Well, a couple people writing in. Yeah, Isabel, Instill Physio, thanks for having these conversations. They're important. And that's what we're trying to do, right? Trying to verbalize it, trying to get it out there. And recognize that these are things that, you deal with as women, you deal with as female athletes, as well. And you can start to notice the discrepancy. And when we have these types of conversations, suddenly a light bulb can go off. And it's like, oh yeah, maybe that's what we should be doing. Or maybe that's something we can implement and move forward with. So really appreciate the two of you with your insight today. Rosie Filion, enjoy. What's retirement life like for you right now? What are you doing?
I'm working every day. I'm at the Radio Canada in French in the sports department. So I talk about sports in the morning show. And I'm crossing my fingers for Tokyo 2021.
Yeah, I love welcoming athletes to the dark side, also known as media. And Pam, obviously we want to see you in Tokyo. So we are keeping our fingers crossed for, a season as well that, I know you're training, but just a season as well where you can get to play and get some games under your belt too, before representing the Maple Leafs. So really appreciate the two of you taking the time. We'll chat with you later.
Thank you.
So Rosie Filion there, two-time Olympic bronze medalist, Pam Buisa, 2019 Pan Am champion with Team Canada. So some exceptional athletes there representing the Maple Leaf. Rosie, obviously now a retired diver. Pam still playing rugby sevens. So two more athletes are going to be joining me now as we continue here on Change the Game, Canadian Women in Sport, media influence on women's sport. So that's what we're talking about right now. The coverage of women in the media is, where can we go from here, how it's affected their career. So I'm welcoming in two new athletes right now. So Sarah Douglas, competitive sailor, 2019 Pan American Games champion. And then I have Jessie Niles as well. Volleyball, who, if I'm not mistaken, Jessie, as I was doing some of my trusty research, did you recently retire?
I did, yes. At the end of August, the end of my career, it was unfortunately pretty anticlimactic due to COVID, but I think that's a sentiment shared by a lot of athletes.
Well, here you go. Here's your grand stage, announcing your retirement from professional volleyball and the national team. So representing the Maple Leaf for quite a long time. So welcome to the two of you. And, I'll get things started, obviously, maybe with you, Jessie. With volleyball, which I absolutely love indoor volleyball. I mean, I love beach volleyball too. Don't tell Melissa Humana Paredes that I said I love indoor volleyball more, but it's such a fabulous sport. And, obviously now that we're talking about the coverage of media and women's sport, where would you put the lack of coverage, especially in North America here on women's volleyball that maybe affected your career, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the opportunity to play volleyball overseas in Europe for a number of years. And so I contrast my experience in North America with my time in Europe. And in Europe, volleyball is very popular, and women's volleyball in particular, if not more popular than men's volleyball. So when I come back to Canada to play for the national team, from my experience, the men's team has historically got a lot more coverage than the women's indoor team. And I think that has had a couple of effects on our team. The lack of coverage means maybe a less sponsorship or attention paid to the team. But additionally, if we think in the long run, and in becoming an Olympic level team is really the efforts of many years. And so I remember when I was growing up, if I'm a young athlete not seeing kind of what I could be into the future, we might be actually losing younger athletes to other sports or different activities if they cannot see themselves in some of the women who are higher up in higher levels of the sport. So I think it can have both immediate short-term impacts, but also these long-term impacts on the success of the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another, pretty interesting conversation to have. It's depending on where you are in certain parts of the world, right? Like there are certain, obviously, sports that'll get more attention, but a lot of times the women are on an equal playing field with men in the coverage. But in North America, we clearly seem to have a problem with equal sports coverage. Now, Sarah, you compete in a sport, right? That's like, I just had Roseline Filion on, and so she kind of said the same thing. Like when you talk about diving, I mean, really that is something you pay attention to maybe once every 4 years with an Olympic cycle. And I almost feel like sailing in a lot of ways is in that same category. So where are you when, your feelings about media coverage and sailing?
Well, sailing's challenging in that it's a niche sport, and we're on the water. It's hard to even have spectators. It's hard to, even if you want to have coverage, to set that up because you have to have some sort of drone, video camera, the videographer is going to be out on the water. And so first we have those challenges of setting it up to be broadcasting, but then because it's niche, you need commentators to explain how the sport works, and it's not always easy. So sailing often will be kind of overlooked and not necessarily put out there because of the challenges that we have, and then along with women involved as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think, Sarah, we're going to try and get you to fix your mic. Oh, the joys of doing everything from home. I wish I could have an audio person come straight to you, but we're gonna try and figure that out. Make sure the mic is clear. But yes, valid point too, right? Because there are certain sports that are just difficult to have access to. You're in the open water, right? And a lot of times it's hard to get spectators to come there. So fascinating as well when you hear just the different challenges that sports are facing in trying to get coverage. But I'll come back to you, Jessie, right now. And I wonder, what's been the hardest part of dealing, with media coverage, especially when it comes to volleyball again, and you're watching it. And I don't know, what's been the frustrating parts for you? And have you thought no, this actually isn't that difficult to include women in it as well? So what's been the hardest part for you?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm naturally an optimist, so I like to see the positive. But some hard parts or frustrating parts of my experience as an athlete is just looking around me and seeing, a whole team or whole group of such inspiring women and just not having their stories heard. And I've recently become quite passionate about social entrepreneurship and just the power that sport can have on society. And so I guess recently I've just been frustrated at this disconnect between the impacts that these female athletes are having on their communities and not having that shared with the greater public.
Mm-hmm. I think, Sarah, do we have you back? Let's do a quick little test here. If you speak, I want to make sure yay, you sound human.
Should be good now. Yeah.
It was a little robotic before there. I was like, ooh, we actually do have some AI here. But all right. So Sarah, you're making some great points, obviously there, and we were able to still understand it. But where do you think some of the misconceptions lie, even when it comes to sailing? Because I did look up, I'm not going to lie. So I looked up laser radial, right? And I was like, okay, so what is this that she competes in? And it is pretty badass, right? But again, when you think about controlling a yacht, a boat, just like anything, right? It's this power, and it's men. Oh, of course, in order to be that powerful, right? To do that, you got to be a man. So do you think sometimes those are also the misconceptions when it even comes to covering women in sailing?
For sure. I think even within our sailing and then within the classes and different types of boats we have, it'll often be like, oh, well, the men will go faster than the women in the laser. But that's definitely not the case. We work just as hard. We work very, very hard to make our boats go fast. And so that'll be kind of conceived. The women are a little bit slower. It's not as exciting to watch. And we'll kind of be left out of the dark a bit in there.
Where would you like to see coverage go when it comes to sailing? Because again, I think you brought up a very valid point in the challenge of covering a sport that's, out in the open water. But then I even look at a sport, it can definitely be done. I look at alpine skiing. They're zipping down a mountain at 160 clicks like an hour. You got to have cameras set up at different locations in order to catch them. And then the fans are at the bottom. So basically the fans in skiing never actually see the race, right? Like unless they're looking up at a big monitor, they never see the race. But we see that if it's done properly, you can really get a good fan base going. Where do you see that when it comes to sailing? Do you think it's there? Does it need to grow even more?
I think it's there, and it's shown in America's Cup, for example, another pinnacle of our sport. They'll have lots of media. It'll be on broadcasted on TV, but when it comes to Olympic sailing, it doesn't quite have that same coverage, and often they'll value necessarily the men over the women. For example, at the Pan Am Games, I was competing in our medal race, and it was a final race. It was a battle for the medals, and the men race was right before ours, and the media boat was full. By the time 30 minutes later, I guess like an hour later, when it came to the women's race, everyone had gone in. All the media had gone in. It was like, well, why not stay out for the women's? And so I think that often is just the men will be valued more. It'll be covered more versus women.
Mm-hmm. I can't even begin to understand the frustration of that, especially when you're getting ready to go out there. And of course you go and win the medal and you're like, hey, kind of, where's everyone at? Because I'm a big deal over here too. But besides, because I just had this conversation with Pam and Rosie, and obviously from the on-air perspective, we talk about the importance of having, more women also on air and giving a different perspective and storytelling and all that kind of stuff. But what about women in positions of power? And maybe I'll just come back to you, Sarah, on this one, because those journalists are making those decisions based on what an executive producer or an editor has told them to focus on. So how much of a difference do you think it would make to have women even represented in those, we call them powers of position, or positions of power, like to make those types of decisions? Like how important is it to have that diversity there where, if you have a female voice saying, actually, that's a pretty big deal too. Like, do you think that would help change things when it comes to the coverage of female athletes?
I think it would make a massive difference for us. We're typically a male-dominated sport. Tokyo, it will be our first gender equal sport. And so with that being so male-dominated, a lot of our, say like high performance directors or staff of these different countries or sport organizations are led by males. And so they might not necessarily think about the female view, how they can showcase their female athletes. They're often thinking about their males within the team. And so if you maybe had some females kind of leading that direction and pushing towards more female stories, it would make a big difference.
Yeah, Jessie, where are you on that as well? Because, I find like the people with the decision makers, bottom lines, like they're the ones who will often say what sport should be shown on TV. And I'm definitely not saying, I work with some incredible, men who are very aware of equal coverage, but bottom line is sometimes it's overlooked not purposely so, in often cases, but because they're men. It's just obviously easier to just show men. And if they have a different voice in there, in particular, a woman's voice, do you think that helps in changing that?
Yeah, I absolutely do think that having a women's voice in positions of power will make a big difference. I can understand from the media's position or organizations the need to be making money or be sustainable as an organization, but I also I would challenge organizations to really lead by example and look at it kind of beyond maybe the bottom line, but how can we impact change by leading by example, and part of that is going to be coming from female leadership at the top. So I think there's so many examples coming up from recently of women in those positions. So it's really exciting to me, and I think it's momentum in the right direction.
So I'll come back to you, Jessie, because I feel like a stat that I'm going to give right now, it offers hope, but it still contributes to frustration. So this past summer, the National Women's Soccer League, they were the first pro, North American league to return to North America. Like, they were the first before even Major League Soccer came back, before NBA, NHL, you name it. It was the National Women's Soccer League who was the first to start their season back off. And they had just recently signed a deal with CBS. Their numbers were incredible. They had one of the highest rated numbers, even ahead of a lot of Major League Soccer games. So that's what I mean by the hopeful part of it. But I guess the frustration part of it is we're still having these conversations about not getting enough coverage. So, because and tell me if you've heard this before, right? Women's sports, they're not on TV because nobody watches them. But I just, again, you look at the NWSL stats and they are pretty, when they're available, people will watch. The Dream Gap Tour, we had, for the women hockey players, we showed that on our streaming service on CBC. Great numbers. So I don't, where are you frustrated? Do you just feel like you're just between a rock and a hard place? You're banging your head when people say, well, people just aren't going to watch women's sports. That's why we don't put it up. And you're like, really? Because look at the numbers.
I totally hear you on that, because I do not believe that line of, people will not watch, because you're discounting, half the population. You've got, millions of women who would love, women and men for that matter. I mean, each men's sports and women's sports each have unique and exciting aspects to it. And, there's so many opportunities. If we had more coverage, speaking to my sport, volleyball, more coverage in North America, we actually just this year, there's the first North American professional league for women starting up on a small scale, which is super exciting. But for most volleyball athletes, we have to go to Europe or overseas to continue our careers. But if we could play at home or closer to home in North America, I think we're going to retain a lot more athletes for a longer time, and then also start to generate a larger fan viewing at home as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. And now here's another thing. And I just mentioned streaming services. So we're seeing that with a lot of sports, right? And bottom line is you still want to get on the main network, and I see that. But we're seeing the way media is going, where you have your main network, but you do have different streaming services. So whether you're on CBC Sports Road to the Big Games on Saturday, Sunday, but CBC Sports also has a lot of stuff being streamed. And then same thing, for a lot of other women's sports out there. There's Twitch. That's my dog, who obviously has her piece to say on women's sports and coverage. But I guess, Sarah, where I'm going with this is, how much do you think that also helps? The fact that now we're seeing a dispersal in the way sports can be covered, whether it's on the main networks or whether it's through digital now. If you're a diehard fan, you can still watch, and how important it is to also have women on those platforms.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about, even if you can't get the main spot on the prime time TV, but having another opportunity to get online, to have things broadcasting, whether it's live on Facebook or YouTube or whatever. I think that's really important. And that's something that we in sailing have often gone towards, because we don't get that primetime spot on TV, but we'll stream on YouTube to show the races.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think then the transition becomes, and Angela Gordon writing in saying, yeah, when they're available, people watch. Same happened this past summer when for the first time the Women's Tour de France had media coverage. So it's true. People will end up watching. So do you think then that's the responsibility of the media to say, look at these numbers, right? Like the people are speaking and they have spoken and we need to do this. Do you think some of that also sits on the shoulders of corporate sponsors who are like, I will invest this type of money if I see it on this type of programming platform? Where do you think that responsibility lies, or is it shared equally between those two?
I think it's shared between the two because it's important to have the numbers to back up and be like, look, these people are watching, they want to see it. They'll share on the whatever streaming service that they want to see more, that they're cheering on from wherever they are in the world. And a company should see that, be like, okay, great, let's try and have them like shown in other places or on the prime time and really push towards that.
Mm-hmm. Is there some, and I feel like I'm going to use the word frustration a lot, because I feel like when we talk about doing that, like corporate sponsors investing money or, just a long-term plan, whenever you talk about women's sports, I'll come back to you, Jessie, it seems like they always discuss the risks around it. So with men, it's considered an investment. Let's invest in this. There might be some loss, but it's okay because we're building towards something. Whereas investing in women, it's not seen so much as an investment, it's seen as a risk. Do you feel like that's typically been the conversation, and that's the mind frame that needs to change? So with men, it's seen as an investment. With women, it's seen as a risk. Like, how much does that also need to change?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I, with my time on the national team, I always felt like, oh, once we reach the next level or once we qualify for the Olympics, then we'll be deserving of, all of this support and this sponsorship. And it was kind of, we internalized some of these messages that, oh, just got to win this. So it was very results oriented and, put even more pressure on ourselves than, we would naturally or normally. So, yeah, like I guess it goes back to that driving force or that intention of supporting that investment. So on the men's side, it's seen as an investment. On the women's, seen as a risk. But if we change the narrative, maybe it's not about maybe the investment or the numbers, but how can we invest in women to actually impact society in general. So, using these inspiring stories of women to create change, broader change in the world.
Yeah, because when you dive into the numbers, you're so right. Like women put that pressure. Well, if I get the results, that means I'll get the money. But you often look sometimes at men's programming and it's like, well, they actually haven't given the best results, but they'll still get the funding, right? So there's, and then you see like, it's this age old argument of, well, wait, no, people don't want to watch women, or they're not fast enough, or they're not this and whatever. But it's like, well, has the investment been there? Has the money been there? Has the training been there? Right. And it's just like, you also have to see what's available to women. And I just wonder, Sarah, again, if we go back to you and just the perception of women in competitive sailing, where do you see that perception being on women compared to that of men who are competitive sailors?
I mean, part of it that I think all women have is just like, what do their parents look like? What is their personality, and not necessarily viewed on their achievements. And that'll often be brought up. And with sailing, we have lots of different types of boats, and each boat you need a different body type, or weight is a really big part of sailing. And so with the men, they'll talk about it, but the women, being women, they might be more reserved on speaking on their height or their weight or the size that they are in that boat. And that's probably the big difference between the men and the women.
Mm-hmm. I just brought that up before with Pam when it came to rugby, or just like in sports in general. You're right. It's almost like with women, it's a little bit more delicate and it's a little bit more personality. And the delicate, take a hike. Obviously, if you're telling more of a story of the woman, I still think that's great. But you're right. Don't talk about that though in replacement of the athletic achievement. I want to know your height. I want to know your weight. I want to know how badass you are. I want to know how strong you are. Right. I want to know that when that boat, hits some wind, right, and hits some waves, that you are the person I want steering it, or else, I'm going to drown. I need to know that you have that strength to do that. And I want to be able to talk about you, in that capacity, because you're right. And I wonder sometimes if that's fear right? Like a lot of times, especially when I speak to, a lot of my male broadcasters, they feel like, well, if I talk about this with a woman, like am I going to be seen that, it's not right to talk about the weight, or it's not right. And I said, well, what is it that's holding you back? And it's because this perception of what a female is, right? The whole feminine versus masculine traits, which also we got into before. And I just wonder, like, how do we break those down? Is it, Sarah, as simple as giving the media permission to be like, no, say my height, say my weight, and you better talk about my accomplishments, and then you can talk about my favorite meal, my favorite color another time.
Absolutely. With sailing, because we're so weight dependent, females will often, in the past, would be like, you know what, I'm not going to share my weight. Or someone would ask me, I'd be like, I'm 5 pounds less than what I actually am. But now what we've kind of come towards in this era is just being open about that weight. When you start with training with a new team, you're like, this is my weight, and everyone shares their weight in the team, and just kind of being more open with that, and having us being open with that more gives the ability for the media to be open. I remember once in a race, the commentator was like, oh yeah, she's quite tall, but never actually mentioned my weight or like what kind of size I was. Just said that I was tall and a larger athlete, but never quite felt comfortable to talk about the weight.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I say it's almost like we as women need to give that permission, because we as women, Jessie, I'll point the finger at ourselves. Like sometimes we're the ones who have created, some narratives, right? Where it's like, you're right. Like, I'm not going to tell you my weight, or I'm afraid to speak on this when it comes to me. I've also interviewed a lot of figure skaters who were so ashamed of the fact that their bodies were very muscular. Because of course, in that sport, it's all about looking, like a little prima ballerina. And they were so there was embarrassment on their part. There was hiding on their part. So how much of it also depends on us embracing who we are, embracing who you are as an athlete, as a competitive athlete, as a ruthless athlete, right? Like how much of it is embracing that? And that can spill over as well to how the media then covers you.
Yeah, I can definitely experience that. And it is a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle sometimes, but, athletes are incredible ambassadors. And so I do think with the platforms that we have right now on social media, as some of the previous panelists were chatting, that we do have more of the ability to control that conversation. And so it does take courage and some bravery to lead that charge. But I think as a collective community, we can do that, and using the platforms that we do have. But it does take that bravery for sure.
Yeah, and I'll end off with you guys the way I ended off with Pam and Rosie as well, because I do find, again, with women athletes, and you correct me, if I'm wrong on this, because I know on certain sports it definitely is the case. And I'll start with you, Jessie. Like we still have an issue with sexualizing female athletes. Like we don't know how to talk about their strength and their athletic achievement without there being some sort of sexual connotation, whereas we seem to have no problem doing it with the men. Do you feel that as well? And, obviously that is something else we need to be cognizant of and change.
Yeah, there's definitely some big challenges. I know playing in Europe, there's a lot of teams are sponsored by big companies. And so the athletes are walking billboards for these sponsors. And unfortunately, a lot of women athletes are hired because of how they look. And so that's something that I faced in my own sport big time. And, I know it's not limited to volleyball. So there's a ton of work to be done on that globally.
Yeah, there was a recent story that came out a couple months ago when it came to the National Women's Soccer League, where there was one owner of a team who said that he wanted certain women to promote the team because they were good looking, and others who actually were the stars of the team were not good looking enough for him. So, he didn't want them to be on billboards and promoting the team, right? So that obviously is a real problem. And I wonder, Sarah, if those are also things that you've noticed when it comes to, the coverage of women, and, that's obviously something that needs to change.
Yeah, it definitely comes up in women's sports. I don't know if it's necessarily in sailing because we don't get covered as much, but just being a female athlete and looking at other athletes and how they're being featured or how they're being presented, their looks come into the picture. with it and how they're presented, and are they wearing makeup, or what is done with their hair? Does their hair look completely different to what they're competing? Is also a big part of their appearance, and that's kind of a big piece of it.
Yeah, no, and it's such a valid point. You're right. Like any guy, it doesn't matter if he's the star on the team. Doesn't matter what he looks like. He's the face of the team. But when it comes to women's sports, still the face of the team may not necessarily be the best player, but it's the best looking, and that's something that still contributes to sexualizing female athletes, and that needs to change. Obviously, when it comes to the world of media and to what we discussed earlier, right? If you put more women in positions of power, they're not going for that. They're not going to go for that. That is for sure. Well, I appreciate the two of you joining me today. Sarah, Jessie, thanks so much for taking the time. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. I've seen your comments throughout the show. Really appreciate the contribution and the kind words. This, of course, being a panel on media influence on women's sports. So it's a conversation we'll continue to have. And when we have athletes share their thoughts and opinions on it, oftentimes it really is helpful in motivating us and showing us what the next steps should be in covering sports. And also, you don't even have to be in the media. If you're a viewer, like we said, sometimes it's in the court of public opinion. If you can just change the way sometimes you think, maybe you don't even realize that you're approaching women in sport that way. You think, maybe it's equal coverage of them and men, and suddenly you realize, maybe I did sexualize where I didn't mean to. So we bring everything to the forefront, and that's why these types of conversations are so important. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.